The February Revolution can appear to be a bit of a paradox. Does it contradict the Marxist principle that a successful revolution must have a conscious leadership? Well, the bourgeoisie certainly tried to paint a picture of February being a spontaneous and bloodless movement in which the whole people were moved of themselves to remove the old regime. This conception, of course, allowed the bourgeoisie to pretend that they had got hold of power without the need for an unsavoury insurrection. Trotsky points out that this false illusion also gained popularity amongst some of the Soviet leaders, who, having taken no leading role in the revolution, wanted to hope that nobody else had either. Now, it's also worth noting that Moscow only saw an echo of the insurrection in Petrograd. Strikes and demonstrations didn't begin until the 27th, but soon the revolution spread, with regiments mutinying and the prisons being opened. In many other cities, the revolution began only on March the 1st, and only gradually spread to the villages as news filtered in from the towns. In this gentler atmosphere, the police chiefs and bureaucrats were often able simply to remove the Tsar's portraits from the wall, declare themselves of the revolution, and hold on to their positions pretty much as before. It was Petrograd that achieved the revolution, the only real arena of struggle. The rest of the country followed, for there was no force anywhere in the country prepared to fight for the old regime. Petrograd, with the largest concentration of the proletariat, expressed most sharply the forces pushing Russia towards a new society. And certainly it was true that acts of revenge by workers and soldiers were surprisingly few and far between. But a 5-day struggle against not only the power of the old state and the 1,443 killed and wounded in the streets hardly added up to a completely bloodless transformation. Clearly someone had to take the key decisions and lead the struggle. But who? Clearly the bourgeoisie, who were terrified at the thought of a revolution and hadn't seen it coming in any case, had not led the uprising. But the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries hadn't seen it coming either. The SR party president Zenzinov said the revolution fell like thunder out of the sky. But as has been shown, even the Bolshevik leaders lagged behind events. Kayarov asserted on the 26th that absolutely no guiding initiative from the party centres was felt. The Petrograd Committee had been arrested, and the representative of the Central Committee, Comrade Shliapnikov, was unable to give any directives for the coming day. Now, in defence of the Bolsheviks, the party had not yet recovered from its weakened conditions of the early war years, and many of its authoritative leaders were abroad or in exile. Those leaders remaining in Petrograd, both Bolsheviks and of other left parties, often didn't consider themselves and were not considered by others capable of playing a guiding role in events. In the end, Shliapnikov did produce an appeal to the soldiers on the morning of the 27th, but actually by the time it was distributed, the troops had nearly all mutinied already in any case. So Trotsky notes that we must lay down as a general rule for those days that the higher the leaders, the further they lagged behind. Certainly the Bolshevik Party had come closest to providing a revolutionary organisation, but it was an extremely weak and scattered one without central direction. Instead, the search for the leaders of the revolution must be made amongst the countless nameless leaders of groups of workers and soldiers. And despite the dilution of the Petrograd proletariat during the war, the years of hard-earned experience of the struggles from 1905 to 17 had not gone entirely wasted. Conscious revolutionary workers and progressive soldiers existed, educated in the past by left parties, particularly by the Bolsheviks, who had often stood alone alongside the workers in the years of reaction. And it was these minor leaders that were able to make an estimation of forces and arrive at a strategic decision for themselves. Their role was no less significant simply because their names were never recorded for posterity. However, as Trotsky says, without a strong revolutionary socialist party, this leadership proved sufficient to guarantee the victory of the insurrection, but it was not adequate to transfer immediately into the hands of the proletarian vanguard the leadership of the revolution. So what does that say about the role of building a revolutionary party? About developing cadres who can play an independent leadership role? Well, that's certainly worth a discussion. But for this account, I'll leave you to think that through further. But to say that it's certainly worth recognising that the work carried out by individual worker Bolshevik cadres was essential to the success of the revolution. But at the same time, as Trotsky explains, part of the answer to the paradox of February, of how a revolution led by workers and peasants came to surrender power to the bourgeois, can be explained by the weak and scattered nature of the Bolshevik party overall. Trotsky explains that in the February fights, the worker Bolsheviks occupied the leading place. But the situation changes the moment the victory is won and its political fortification begins. The elections to the organs and institutions of the victorious revolution attract and challenge infinitely broader masses than those who battled with arms in their hands. Only a small minority of the workers understood that the Bolsheviks were different from other socialist parties. The workers elected socialists, that is, those who were not only against the monarchy, but against the bourgeoisie. But in doing this, they made almost no distinction between the three different socialist parties. But it was the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries that dominated the intelligentsia, that had the staff and spokespeople that helped them win an overwhelming majority amongst the working class at first in elections to the Soviets. Trotsky notes that even in the elections to the Soviet of the Vyborg district, worker Mensheviks won the leadership at first. He explains that Bolshevism in that period was still only simmering in the depths of the revolution. Thus, the official Bolsheviks, even in the Petrograd Soviet, represented an insignificant minority who had, moreover, none too clearly defined its tasks. The social revolutionaries also got considerable backing from the votes of the soldiers. That's because the voices speaking up most clearly against the monarchist officers were clerks, the young wartime officers from the intelligentsia and so on, who all oriented towards the rather amorphous social revolutionaries. And again, Trotsky says, the representation of the garrison thus turned out to be incomparably more moderate and bourgeois than the soldier masses themselves. But the latter were not conscious of this difference. It would reveal itself to them only during the experience of the coming months. The workers, on their part, were trying to cling as closely as possible to the soldiers in order to strengthen their blood-bought union and more permanently arm the revolution. And since the spokesmen of the army were predominantly half-baked social revolutionaries, this fact could not help but raise the authority of that party, along with its ally, the Mensheviks, in the eyes of the workers themselves. Thus resulted the predominance in the Soviets of the two compromise parties. So, the Mensheviks and the SRs, the two compromise parties, dominated, and they sought to hand power over to the bourgeois. But was that an inevitable outcome of the February Revolution? Trotsky answers very clearly that no, this was certainly not inevitable. The revolution had found the proletariat at a far higher political level than in previous revolutions, where the bourgeoisie had stood on the sidelines and then quietly gathered up the power. No, the workers had formed a new organ of revolutionary power, the Soviet, based upon the armed strength of the masses, that could have taken power in its own hands in February. Just to give one example, when on March the 1st, Rodzianko, leader of the Provisional Committee that had supposedly taken the power, needed to reply to the Tsar, he was too scared to go to the telegraph office alone. The telegraph workers would only take orders from the Soviet. It was the Soviet that had the real power, not Rodzianko's Provisional Committee. No, the solution to the paradox of February must also be found in the contradictory character of the petty bourgeois Democrats and Socialists in the leadership of the Soviet. Trotsky explains that this middle class layer had taught the masses that the bourgeoisie is an enemy, but themselves feared more than anything else to release the masses from the control of that enemy. And yet the reactionary bourgeoisie, who had fled in terror from the revolution, were turned by these socialists into the key to the revolution's success. In line with the theoretical excuses of Menshevism discussed in earlier videos, Sukhanov put it as follows: "The power destined to replace Tsarism must be only a bourgeois power. We must steer our course by this principle. Otherwise the uprising will not succeed and the revolution will collapse." But these supposedly revolutionary bourgeois were actually busily trying to hand power on yet one step further. They were hatching plans to use Grand Duke Mikhail as the head of a constitutional monarchy, from which they then planned to later claw back the gains of the revolution altogether. Now the Tsar did finally abdicate on March the 2nd in favour of Mikhail, but unfortunately for the bourgeoisie, the masses were not prepared to accept their betrayal as easily as they had swallowed that of the Soviet leaders. So the bourgeoisie were forced to give up their plan for a monarchist fig leaf to cover their treachery. Nevertheless, thanks to the Soviet leaders, the Provisional Committee of the Duma were able to announce on March the 2nd the setting up of their provisional government. It consisted of a handful of the very richest landlords and industrialists. But the Soviet socialists were content. They only wanted to be a left-wing opposition in a bourgeois regime, not the leaders of a people's uprising. They accepted the new government without a word on the question of war, of republic, of land, of the 8-hour day, or any of the other burning issues. So Trotsky concludes on the outcome of the February Revolution with the following line: "In giving their confidence to these socialists, or supposed socialists, the workers and soldiers found themselves, quite unexpectedly, expropriated politically. They were bewildered, alarmed, but did not immediately find a way out. Their own betrayers deafened them from above with arguments to which they had no ready answer, but which conflicted with all their feelings and intentions. The proletariat and the peasantry voted for the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries, not as compromisers, but as opponents of the Tsar, the capitalists and the landowners. But in voting for them, they created a partition wall between themselves and their own aims. They could not now move forward without bumping into this wall erected by themselves and knocking it over."